Welcome to the Estate of Reality podcast. Join two of the smartest people in real estate as they talk about the reality of today's real estate world. It's nothing like TV. This is the real world. If you are planning to buy, sell, or invest in real estate, or if you are a real estate agent, this podcast is for you. Your hosts are Melissa Haley, broker for North Texas Top Team and CEO of Agent Advantage Coaching and Training, as well as Stephen Etzel, real estate broker, instructor, and owner of Stephen Etzel Real Estate Consulting. Join them as they talk about all things real estate. Subscribe today to catch all of the episodes.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I am Melissa Haley, the CEO of Agent Advantage Coaching and Training and the broker for the North Texas Top Team Realtors. And today I am joined as per usual with Stephen Etzel. Stephen, say hi and tell everybody a little about yourself.
I'm Steve Etzel. I'm broker owner of Independent Realty and Education and Training.
Awesome. And today, Stephen and I have a great guest, Sean Clemmensen with Tiago Title. Thanks for being here with us today, Sean. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
So for everybody listening, Sean is with Tiago Title. He is a real estate attorney, and they've got 4 locations. They serve all of Texas. They serve people even that aren't near their locations because they do lots of mobile closings. So if you guys need a title service, call Sean. He does a great job.
Appreciate it.
So Sean, tell us what are some of the things that what are people bringing up in title right now? What are some hot topics of things that are going on in your business at this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I'll answer it from both the title side of things, and I'll answer it from the real estate attorney, law firm side of things. And the title side of things, and it's been a hot topic for the last 2 to 3 years, but we're having a lot of wire fraud. Right, that continues to be a hot topic. There's a more recent hot topic, I would say, in the last 3 to 6 months of what people call what's being called seller imposter fraud. So you have people imitating sellers, using fake driver's license, fake government issued IDs, fake passports. It's become such a hot topic that Texas Association of Realtors, or Texas Realtors, I should say, I keep calling it TAR, has put out bulletins on it. The Texas Land Title Association in the last few months has pulled bulletins out on it. So that's a pretty hot topic in the title insurance world. It's a new topic. And so there's a title insurance underwriters, the large national insurance companies are really figuring out ways, or trying to figure out ways to combat it. That's probably the most hot topic that we see right now. Everything, hot topics. I mean, business is still good. Texas is great. People ask me, well, what's the state of the market? I'm like, well, it hadn't really slowed down. I think one thing that's increased, though, in the title insurance world, and I guess law world too, what I call creative financing. Back in the 90s, for those that remember, you had a lot of what we call wrap transactions. For some of you remember that guy down in Austin, Wally Wrap. You had the whole Wally Wrap transaction. So creative financing is increasing. Wraps subject to seller financing just by nature of a rising interest rate environment, which is what we have right now. On the legal side of things, it's usually the same topics that come up literally every single day. Seller failed to disclose a water leak. Can I sue them? So DTPA, Commonwealth fraud, statutory fraud type causes of action. Hey, I'm in an earnest money dispute. How did I get my earnest money back? And what we saw the last 2 or 3 years in this crazy market that we had were these insane, what we call convenience clauses and builder contracts, where builders could just decide to terminate a contract for convenience, right? And so we see a lot of those. I still get phone calls every day about disputes with builders and how to get out of those contracts and what are the legal ramifications of doing so, and what are the benefits or drawbacks to pursuing any sort of lawsuit against a builder. So I hit that on both sides for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go jump in with the first question. How about that? Is that all right?
Go for it.
He did a great intro, and I got a lot to cover of what you just said. So we're going to start from the beginning. Let's put it that way. Let's start from the beginning. All right, first and foremost, wrap loans. I hear that there's some new rules and regulations about wrap loans, and I also hear there's some rules and regulations about assigning. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what a wrap is, number one. And number two, I don't think a lot of people understand that when you start assigning contracts, the person you assign to have to understand they got to take that contract as what's agreed upon. And there should be a disclosure involved in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, two great points, Stephen. The first are as it relates to wrap transactions. So if you look at it, a wrap transaction is essentially creating a new loan in favor of the wrap lender, right, of an existing mortgage. So you have John Smith, seller, that's got a mortgage with Wells Fargo. John Smith, seller, then decides that he wants to sell to maybe an investor. And maybe the investor doesn't have enough to pay off the loan. So the John Smith sellers gets approached by the investor. Investor says, how about we create a wrap transaction or a wrap loan? And I pay you as the seller, and you as the seller then pay your underlying mortgage. So if John Smith owes Wells Fargo $1,000 a month on his underlying mortgage and creates a new lien where the investor is his borrower with a monthly payment of $1,500 a month, then John Smith's seller gets $500 and $1,000 gets paid to Wells Fargo, the underlying mortgage. So the seller essentially becomes a lien holder. You see it a lot with investors that purchase properties with a hard money loan and then in turn sell it to different parts of various communities that are unable to qualify for loans, may not have the credit that they need to have. We see it a lot in areas like Garland, Mesquite, cities like that, where you see individuals maybe have a lot of cash on hand but don't have enough credit, so they then purchase these on what we call wrap loans. There were changes to the laws as it relates to wrap loans a couple of years back, where it's got to close at a title company's office or an attorney's office. If you purchase a owner's title insurance policy in connection with that, with the purchase, there are exceptions as to what has to be disclosed or what doesn't have to be disclosed under 5.016 of the finance code and the property code. So there are new regulations that were designed to protect the consumer. We do a lot of wrap transactions. The second part of your question as it relates to assignments, for those that don't know, a typical assignment, let's call it 123 Main Street LLC contracts with a seller. And on the contract, they write as the buyer 123 Main Street and or assigns, right, in an attempt to disclose to the seller that they intend to assign it. And then 123 Main Street goes out and starts marketing the property to other investors. And what is required as it currently stands under the law is that you market that all you're doing is selling an equitable interest in that property versus fee simple title or fee simple ownership interest in that property. You find what we call an end buyer. The end buyer then steps into the shoes of 123 Main Street LLC, the original buyer that contracted with the seller, and then proceeds towards closing and purchases the property. It's what we call, as you guys know, wholesaling. Right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of, I'm sorry, man, I get all fired up. Sometimes investors don't think they have to give a seller's disclosure notice because they're not transferring a dwelling, when 5.008 might say something a little different. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think a disclosure, I mean, you're always going to have I'm always going to suggest and providing some sort of disclosure notice, right? I mean, sellers for sure have to provide seller's disclosure notice unless you fit with one of the pretty tailored narrow exemptions. Wholesalers too. I mean, wholesalers, the one that originally contracts the property and then wholesale to the end buyer, needs to disclose that it's an equitable interest. If they become aware of any defects, maybe in a conversation that they had with the seller, you should disclose those to the end buyer too. I mean, as they say, disclose, disclose, disclose. And that's how you ultimately protect yourself. When you don't disclose is when you find yourself hiring a real estate attorney like me, paying way too much money per hour to go file a lawsuit and seek some sort of legal remedy. And it doesn't make sense when all you have to do is disclose.
Yeah.
Cover your apples.
It's
that simple, right?
That's what they say. That's what they say.
So if they are going to sign over, are there some new rules and regulations about that too? Whoever's going to receive the
you're going to see the new rule has passed and it's going to come out essentially January 1st, which is you have to disclose the seller has to be aware that it's going to be an assignment, right? So it doesn't, what I've been telling investors, it doesn't really, it hasn't changed my position all along, right? My position for 10 plus years has been, you need to disclose to the seller that you intend to assign the contract, right? For liability reasons, you want to fully disclose it, right? Was there a requirement always that you had to do that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago? No, right? But you did it to avoid a seller coming back and suing you for failing to disclose, for deception, for fraud. So it hasn't changed the position or other real estate attorneys' position to always disclose it to the seller, but now you actually have to disclose it for the seller. And one of the easiest ways that what a lot of investors do is just, in the buyer paragraph 1 of the contract, if you're using the TREC contract, 123 Main Street and/or assigns, right? It'll remain to be seen whether or not that constitutes a sufficient disclosure. It is certainly a disclosure. When I draft contracts for investors, you will see a bit more detailed and comprehensive disclosure that I put in their contracts, that I write for them. It's much more detailed than and/or assigns. We'll see whether and/or assigns is sufficient or not as a disclosure to the seller, but that'll remain
added in the commercial contracts, TXR commercial contracts.
Yeah, I mean, the commercial contracts, it's great that you put that, because you actually have to elect whether you can or cannot assign the contract. So it's very difficult in the commercial world for a seller to go, "Ooh, I didn't know that was going to be assigned." Well, the hell you didn't, right? I mean, it's checked right there. So I mean, and ignorance is no excuse under the law for not reading the contract. So I love the commercial contract. If it was up to me, man, if it was up to me, I'd take, just like we did with option and earnest, I would take all the really good provisions of the commercial contract and I'd start inserting them in the TREC contract. And I realized that Melissa Haley right here is in a position that maybe she could suggest that gets done. I don't know. Just saying.
Good. In my new broker lawyer.
I don't want to. I'm not trying
You're
to.
on the broker lawyer committee, huh?
I start in about 30 days, my friend. First meeting.
I got a list for you.
I'm sure you do.
Plus, I got a long list. No, I'm just kidding. I think the broker lawyer committee, we're so blessed. I tell people this all the time. We're so blessed in the state of Texas with the contracts that we have, the procedures, the Texas Real Estate Commission, the broker lawyer committee. Like, I think we've got it best in all 50 states. But like anything, when something is changed, just like this assignment, the new change in the law that Stephen's referring to, when something changes or the law changes or reform changes, that's when comments start to come up. That's when changes then have to be proposed. And it's just about being flexible and adapting every single time. It was like when the HOA addendum came out, I think I sent like a 3-page dissertation to the general counsel at TREC about my opinions on the HOA addendum that was changed. So, and then it changed back for a little bit better.
That's good. I mean, but I don't think people really realize though, TXR forms are basically written by TXR. TREC forms are written by the broker lawyer committee. So a lot of that kind of crosses over and kind of hard to manipulate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, true statement. Well, there's other stuff, because you were talking about disclosure. And I love the part about disclosure for, wholesaling and disclosure for this equitable interest that's going to transfer, not that we're selling you the property, because the seller is selling you the property, not me as that person in the middle. But there's other stuff that people fail to disclose on. And it is not, what I tell people sometimes is this is bigger than Texas real estate stuff. This is like a federal law. So it's a big deal. And I think people need to know that, especially when they're just filling out their little seller's disclosure notice on just a Joe Schmo selling their house. They need to really stop and focus and pay attention, because deceptive trade is a big deal, right?
It's a huge deal. And I think it's, and I don't fault the consumer for not giving it the attention or how serious it is to complete it, but it is extremely serious because of what an aggrieved party could sue over. Like you said, DTP or Deceptive Trade Practices Act, common law fraud, statutory fraud. And when you start suing over those things, you can not only get what your damages are, you can get treble damages. So what's a $30,000 dispute could become 90. and then you could pay attorney's fees. And so it's very much serious in taking, when you complete the seller's disclosure notice, you have to take it serious, because what a lot of consumers don't understand is that even if I accidentally complete it incorrectly, and that's still an affirmative statement, right? It's still an affirmative misrepresentation. It doesn't matter whether it was an accident or not. I mean, now the law does differentiate between intentional and accidents, but it is really, really important. It's one of probably the most common question I get every day from real estate agents, certainly buyers that have purchased a property. Hey, I believe the seller knew about this water leak. I want to sue them, right? And that's just usually what it goes to. And it involves really talking about it and flushing out why they think they knew, what the amount of the damages are. And sometimes, to be candid, when they're like, well, Mr. Clemmensen, it was $275 to fix the water leak. I'm like, you want to sue over $275?
Yeah.
You're gonna pay me more to write a letter than $275. So that, it doesn't make any sense. But there are people where it's just yesterday, I think it was about a $50,000 foundation issue, and we have to talk about it, right? And we have to go through it. And in that one, in particular, they had what I call a smoking gun, which was they called the foundation company, and the foundation company was like, yeah, they call like one of the most common ones more popular ones in DFW. And the foundation company, like receptionist, was like, oh yeah, we went out to that property like 6 months ago and advised them that they had to fix, 18 piers and beams. You're like, oh, that's a winner, But one of the other things with disclosures that I'll hit on really quick too is for the agent is agents often ask, well, is there any way that I can be held liable, or what's my role or responsibility as an agent when a seller is completing a seller's disclosure? And an agent or a broker really can only be held liable if they know that the seller lied or intentionally misled on the seller's disclosure notice, right? That's about the only time that as an agent or a broker, you can be held liable. So what I tell agents oftentimes, and it comes up probably 5 to 10 times a year, where they're like, I sat through one of your seller's disclosure classes, Sean, and the seller told me they had a foundation issue or a previous flood and, a previous fire. And then I noticed they didn't fix it, or they didn't answer it correctly on the seller's disclosure. What should I do? I'm like, well, you need to respond to them and tell them, hey, look, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not allowed to practice law, but I do know that you told me about this. I'm sure it was just an inadvertent mistake. You should probably update the seller's disclosure and send it back to me. And if their response is, I'm not doing that, or no, I don't want to disclose it because I don't believe I have to disclose it, and I talked to my attorney, which is probably not true. I talked to my attorney and he said I don't have to disclose it. Then you got to know when to fire your client, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest things.
Well, I mean, on the flip note of that, we have laws and regulations, 531 of the Trade Code and also Article 2. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? So if you know we had situations. I had one situation on the seller's disclosure notice where they were fighting over earnest money. Well, they terminate the contract. However, agent checked the wrong box for termination. And so the lawyer said, you can't terminate it or this. Again, you can't go back and re-terminate a contract. That's what makes sense, right? So he goes, well, what about the seller's disclosure notice? And what happened was the agent should have known it was in a water conservation district, because you find those all over the place. Yeah. And the seller checked the box, city water. Oopsie. And so what happened was, that's a blatant, you're on a well. Come on, people, not city water. So that was actually, I mean, this is an extreme case, obviously, but that's what they're actually using to get out of the contract, and it worked, and they got their earnest money back. So
I mean, and it can work too. I mean, and it is really important, as you guys both noted. I mean, you have to pay attention to what you're terminating, because as real estate brokers and agents, I mean, the average consumer is relying on you for your expertise, right? Yeah. So you have to pay attention to what box you check. And one of the most common ones we see is where there's a lack of understanding between buyer approval and property approval, and which one.
That's what it was. That's exactly what it was.
And it's like, you gotta, if it's buyer approval, it's buyer approval. It's property approval, it's property approval. If you terminate for property approval, but it was buyer approval, you didn't have a valid reason for termination, right? And I've been consulted way too many times on questions like that. And a lot of times it comes, who do you think the people want to go after for the earnest money? It's usually not the other side. It's probably the agent.
It's the agent for not knowing their business. That's why we
Well,
got, that's what they
that's
pay
a
us for, is
compliment.
for that information.
That's exactly what happened. They checked box 2 instead of box 3. Here we are.
That's why education is so important, and why I think all of us on here are so passionate about it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
So Stephen brought up earnest money though, and I think you mentioned that at some point earlier too, Sean, is earnest money is one of those things that you get some calls about. What kind of things do you see on the earnest money front? Because that's sometimes it's $1,000 or $2,000, but sometimes it's $10,000 or $20,000. And that's a lot of money that's on the line when somebody is terminating a contract. What comes across your desk?
That is a lot of money. It's all relative, right? I mean, I always tell folks, whether it's 1,000 or 100,000, I've seen really it all. I mean, I've been not only on the title side, we've seen people terminate over and fight over small amounts of earnest money, $1,000, $1,500. But we've had large commercial closings where people are fighting over $500,000 or $1 million on some of our larger commercial transactions. So we see it on the title side. I see it on the law firm side, where people want to retain me over $1,500 in earnest money. And a lot of the reasons too are it's emotional, right? A lot of the reason that earnest money disputes just occur in general are emotions.
Yeah.
Somehow throughout the course of the transaction, the buyer became upset, or the seller became upset, or honestly, one of the agents on the seller's agent or the buyer's agent end up getting crosswise, don't like each other, and can't really serve as that gatekeeper of calming the emotions down, talking to the client, making sure that everybody understands the consequences or what can happen. I feel like that's a large part of what I do as an attorney, is really get people to understand emotions, take the emotions out of it, and then talk about what it looks like. And for $2,000 earnest money, I just gave you the quick Cliff Notes version. Hey, look, this is what it's going to look like. First, we're going to go to mediation, right? If you want to hire me as your attorney, I charge X number of dollars, right? You're going to pay half the cost of the mediator's fee. Let's be cheap today. Let's call it $500 each side. Okay, so that's $500. Maybe you pay me $500 to send a letter. So now you're at $1,000. So we go to mediation. The mediator's an impartial third party, has no binding authority whatsoever other than to give you a suggestion. You take off a day of work. Everybody goes down there. At the end of the day, the mediator goes, let's just split the baby because I think both of you made mistakes here. So you get 1,000 and you get 1,000. And then you go, I don't just want 1,000. So then you decide to sue them in justice of the peace court because of the jurisdictional limits. You sue them in justice of the peace court, and now you're going down. Whenever you're doing discovery, you're doing depositions, you're going to hearings, you're taking off work every single time, all to go to a judge or a jury that goes, you know what, let's just split the baby, right? And so for smaller amounts of earnest money, and I use the term small, and it's all relative, right? $1,000 is still a lot of money. But when you're in that $2,000, $2,000, $3,000 range, these ultimately get worked out because the cost of litigation and the cost of mediation outweighs generally the amount that you're going to get. And so what I always tell buyers or sellers that find themselves in this situation, look, like I'm a very principled guy. I mean, attorneys love principled people, right? Because you're the ones that make us a decent amount of money. But practically, it doesn't make sense for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, right? Work it out. Not to mention the other ramifications for a seller that's in an active lawsuit and can't sell the property because there's a clause, right? So, but when you start to get $5,000 or above, then the risk may, the reward may outweigh the risk, because 5, 10, 15, 20, yeah, heck yeah, hire an attorney, sue or mediate, sue, whatever it is that you got to do. But for by and large, most of the calls I get are $2,000, $3,000 in earnest money. They're usually under $5,000. And that's the way these calls go with the buyers and the sellers. And they end up going, yeah, you know what? It's just not worth it. The emotional toil, the emotional impact that this would have on me and my family over $2,000 just isn't worth pursuing. So
they watch a lot of Judge Judy.
Yeah, well, they do. But But I mean, all joking aside, I mean, when you're in justice of the peace court, it's very much like Judge Judy. I mean, there are very good JP court judges out there, but I mean, I always remind everyone, like, not all of them are lawyers. Not all of them have judicial experience. Not all of them have experience in contract law or real estate law. So you kind of don't really know when you go in there. It's kind of like Judge Judy, although Judge Judy is actually one. You go in there and it's like, well, I think we should do what's fair, rather than maybe applying the facts to the law and making a determination in favor of the one party that should possibly win. Now, and then there's the other side of this too, the other side of this coin, which is how does it work with title companies? Well, title companies are neutral third parties. I mean, not Switzerland, right? I'm neutral to the buyer and I'm neutral to the seller. And when people terminate, especially like at Tiago, and it's outside the option period and there's a fight over the earnest money, a lot of the phone calls we field are, well, Sean, but this is what the contract says. They should get this back. And I mean, I always have an opinion about it, but that's sort of the thing. I can't say my opinion, because if I decide to interpret what happened in favor of the buyer to the disadvantage of the seller, now the seller could sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, which is why every title company that I know of requires a signed release of contract and earnest money outside the option period.
I think a lot of people don't understand that earnest and option are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, we just had this come up yesterday on a file where the amount of the earnest was given, right? I think it was 3,000, but it should have been 3,000 plus 100 option. And one of the agents said, well, they don't have a option fee anymore. I'm like, well, actually they do, because the money goes first to option and then to earnest. Now you might have a seller that's defaulted because they didn't give the earnest in time, entitling your seller to pursue its remedies under the contract, which would be what? Terminate the contract. But they got an option period. So, it's just reminding people the contracts it's a complex document. And so it just takes going through it sometimes and just educating everybody on it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Confused.
Well,
go
ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I said, I see that all the time. People in class, they always ask me earnest option. They're two different things,
Two different things. Two totally different things.
Yeah. And they do two different functions, but people get confused because they pay them sometimes in one big payment.
Well, I mean, Melissa and Stephen, if I could change one thing in the industry as a whole, it would be this mistaken notion that's been taught for 10, 15, 20, 30 years that somehow earnest money is consideration for a contract. Right? Oh, it bugs me. I mean, it's like when I hear agents say it, like, I'm like, oh, please, like, where did you hear that? Because it's not. I mean, you have offer, acceptance, and consideration. The consideration is the bargain for exchange between the parties. I agree to buy your house. You agree to sell it to me for $200,000. All it. Boom, done. That's all I need, right? I don't need earnest money to make a contract binding. That would probably be the number one thing I would change.
Here's how I point that out. Go into paragraph 5, go down to termination B. It says nominal consideration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if you go down to C and D, what does it say? Dollar amount for consideration, or the seller may back out of the contract. Two different verbiage right there, people.
Different things.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we've chatted about fraud and then deception, right? We've chatted a little bit about earnest money and getting that back. I think that one of the other things that we talked about a little bit, or that we should talk about a little bit, is I'm going to circle us back to that fraud discussion, because you mentioned, fraud when someone's not filling out the seller's disclosure, and it's not really fraud; it's just deception. You're not disclosing.
Failure it could arise to common law fraud potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, but what about like wire fraud? I mean, everybody's email signature in any deal I do, somewhere somebody's got a thing that says wire fraud, special notice, wire fraud. And there's also a big deal right now with sellers being defrauded. And so can we chat a little bit about those for a second?
Yeah, on wire fraud, that's been around for several years now. it's always when title companies started putting out the, be sure you call, be sure you call. I mean, we have a disclosure notice that when we send our commitment out and the wire instructions out, be sure you call and verify. It's a difficult thing, and I'm not going to pretend to be a tech guy here or anybody that's well versed in cybersecurity, anything like that. But a lot of times you see it with certain email providers where it's AOL or it's Hotmail, and you actually see that somebody's email has been hacked, or like our emails end in Tiago TX, right? And somebody creates an email that's Tiago Title TX, right, which is not our email domain, and sends an email to a buyer says, hey, here's your cash to close amount, which is why it's so important to call and verify with the trusted number that you've already known with the title company. And I think it's important too and I see agents do it. I think it's important too for agents to also remind their client, hey, don't forget to call. Not that the agent would ever be held liable for anything like that, or even frankly the title company, because it's Tiago TX is our domain, right? I mean, if somebody sends it from Tiago Title TX, I mean, that's not our domain. But we all want to make sure that we're protected. We all want to make sure that nothing like that happens. And so those are just steps that can be taken to ensure it. There's been this sort of shift in the industry where folks are going, well, gee, sort of people started talking about wire fraud 2 or 3 years ago. Oh, geez, I don't want to send a wire, Tiago, for my closing costs because of the wire fraud. And I totally respect that. But what people oftentimes forget is that cashier's checks aren't instantaneous, right? Cashier's checks can delay funding. And you guys both have probably seen this on multiple title companies' signature blocks. If you have a cashier's check for more than $10,000 or $20,000, please note that this could delay funding up to 48 hours. And that's true. I mean, it can take 48 hours at a minimum for a cashier's check to clear. And so sometimes, you just have to do the best that you can to try to avoid it.
Pick your battle, And
as agents, we disclose it many times too,
Well, I just saw an article that came out, or a news blurb, from apparently some fake cashier's checks from a bank. A Fifth Third Bank is an actual bank, but apparently somebody was creating what they call phantom cashier's checks with a Fifth Third Bank is the sort of the bank on it, and they would give these checks. And I don't know if it was happening in Texas, but I know it was happening outside of Texas, where they would give these checks to the title company, right? And then they'd say, well, for the whole cash to close, let's call it $200,000. And then they'd be like, oh, but I'm going to terminate my option. So then they would terminate, and they'd ask the title company to send back their full down payment for the sales price of the home back to them. And lo and behold, some of these title companies would do it. And then the cashier's check would come back. The bank would come back 5-7 days later and go, yeah, that money didn't exist. All right. So we call those phantom cashier's checks. So that's a real thing too. Now, I can't say we've ever seen it, but I was just reading an article on that the other day. Now, we don't let people wire or give us a cashier's check or send us the whole down payment for the sales price or anything like that until it gets closer to closing, right? I'm not going to because I'm not a bank, I'm not going to take your $500,000 3 weeks before closing, right? But some title companies were doing that with these phantom cashier's checks. So you just do the best that you can to try to avoid wire fraud, cashier's check fraud.
Yeah. That's crazy stuff. I didn't realize there was cashier's check fraud. I knew there was wire fraud, but I also feel like today you got to be, just as a human being,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're buying a house or not, you got to be careful on the internet. You got to be careful that somebody doesn't send you some virus. You got to be careful that you didn't get defrauded out of money because somebody sent you wire instructions. And I think that that's important to clarify. That's what happens, right? Is I'm buying a house and I get an email that's a spoof email. It's not your real email, like you were saying. And it says, Melissa, your closing is coming soon. Please send your hundreds of thousands of dollars to this bank account, to this routing number. And it happens to be in, I don't know, the Caymans or somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, that happens, or the reverse happens where, you know, the seller, right? It's already under contract. They send you their wire instructions, or maybe you get them, and then they decide all of a sudden last minute, the day before closing, to change their wire instructions. That happens too. And it's not really them changing their wire instructions. It's somebody that either hacked their email, created a similar email to what the seller's email was, and then said, no, these are my new wire instructions. That's why we ask for people to bring their wire instructions to closing. Like, I don't want your wire instructions before closing. That's one of the things that we do.
I want you to hand deliver the notice from your bank.
Yeah, I want you to hand deliver. I want you to hand deliver.
Our coverage now covers, cybersecurity too. So that's
yeah, I mean, and I think it'll be interesting to see too where, and I'm no E&O insurance expert, but it'll be interesting to see what those, I know what we pay, but it'd be interesting to see what that covers, what it costs, if there's going to be an increase in the amount of the insurance that's paid. And I don't.
Yes. Insurance always goes up.
Yeah. It's never gone down, that's for sure. It's always
it's always gone up for some.
Never gone down.
No.
So can we talk a little bit about that? Because you were mentioning seller wire fraud, which also is probably a little less common, because as a title company, you're like on it, right? As opposed to a consumer who may just not know, right? So buyer purchasing a house, wire fraud kind of stuff might be a little bit more prevalent. But you mentioned earlier, seller fraud is on the rise, and this is not wire fraud. This is like, do I own that property that's being sold? Like, tell me a little bit about what's going on there, because that's become quite a hot topic lately.
Yeah, I mean, and there are a few variations or iterations of it. One that you guys may have seen a news article that came out a few years ago where, and this is one iteration of it. There was a news article that came out. Everyone's innocent until proven guilty, right? But there were allegations that an individual in and around Dallas-Fort Worth was going around and essentially taking deeds from, finding out people that were deceased in title, that maybe died in 2010, and executing deeds on their behalf in 2015 or 2020, and then over to the investor, and then the investor would turn it around and sell it. That's one iteration of it. And, that was probably 2 or 3 years ago that came out. So it was essentially forged deeds. And I don't think forged deeds are a new thing. I think forged deeds do happen. It was just the way in which it happened. You sometimes will see forged deeds between family members. One of the siblings is saying, well, this is my property, my friend shouldn't get it. And, as a title company, it's really hard to, if you see a document filed, a record from 2020, and putting a deed in somebody else's name, it's very difficult to go, well, geez, how do we know that was forged? Well, you don't, right? You don't know if something was forged. Then the other iteration of sort of this fraud is maybe somebody with the name, let's call him John Smith, okay? Because John Smith's a common name. Let's call it John Smith, says he owns a property and goes under contract, and sends it to a title company, and then closes and gets wired the money and has a fake ID and or a fake passport. Everything's fake. That's another iteration of it. That's the one that seems a little bit newer, right? That's where we started hearing about it in the last 2 or 3 months. So that's a different form of it. Scary. No doubt about it, but that is happening too.
So what you're saying is, if my name is John Smith and I own some property, and it's probably not a house, right? It's probably more like land, because if it was a house, the real estate agent is going to come to my house and walk through the property with me, and I'm going to let them in the door, and they're going to know that I'm the homeowner.
Most of the time, right, but maybe not, right? You may sell without an agent. Somebody may have posted it on Zillow, right? Posted it on Zillow. It's possible. Or maybe everybody's in it together. I mean, you know, you just don't know. And that's sort of the thing that's coming up, that the industry is going, well, goodness gracious, like, you know, what can you do to stop it? I mean, how do you stop it? I mean, you obviously, you know, tell that, I mean, I tell the FBI, I mean, you do everything that you can, but I don't know how, and I don't think the industry as a whole, but being the national underwriters or the American Land Title Association, I think they have an idea as to what you can or cannot do. You just have to be as diligent as possible. And you know, there's that whole, you know, does it pass the smell test? You know?
Yeah.
And, you know, what is your gut telling you? What are the interactions like with the person? Because there are, in some of the articles I've been reading, there are some really, 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 really sophisticated things, like certainly that were like going on in like New York in the last couple months, New Jersey, Florida, super sophisticated, like not just like mom and pop were doing it, like a sophisticated rings of people that were doing it. So, you know, and I think for the common person, it's monitoring the property. I think, you know, I used to get questions starting about a year ago. Hey, you know, there's this like warranty, so to speak, that you can put on your home. It's like a life lock for the title to your house. And people know, do you know, should we do this? And I'm like, I don't know enough about it. But I think it's like a title lock or a life lock for your home. And if it sees that anything is transferred, it alerts you, which may not be a bad thing. And, you know, obviously an added expense. But the sophistication of these people is just, it's remarkable what people.
You know what's interesting? It's always the same states. So that leads me to believe there might be something that could happen at the state level. I don't know about that.
Comments to myself.
It's always the same states.
It's always, we always see that things like this appear to originate on the East Coast, and we sort of see it last, right? Like, I don't know if stuff's happening in Montana or Wyoming or whatever.
Yeah, you never hear about them.
Never hear about them, right? Because they're not huge metroplex areas, but you tend to hear about the stuff when you start reading about it and reading these articles, and usually it originates on the East Coast.
Yes. The same
whatever that's worth. Take it for what it's worth. I don't know.
I think
there's a lot more people, you know, where there's more opportunity. Man.
I think there's different rules and regulations when it comes to real estate laws too. I mean, if you think about it, like Florida's got way different laws than we have. They don't have agency laws in Florida, so you got to look at it and go, anybody can close a transaction. So I mean, it's kind of loose, if you will. Where Texas, I believe, is one of the strongest consumer protection states.
Oh, I think that's 100% true. I mean, I often tell people, especially at closings, when they're like, "Well, geez, I mean, this title insurance policy seems a bit high," you know, and they've moved from California where it was $100, you know, and it's, you guys know, it's regulated in the state of Texas, so it's based on your sales price. And yeah, it's higher, but I always tell them, yeah, it's higher here for a reason. One, we have a much more complex regulatory system for insurance, title insurance in Texas, and two, our real property laws are much more complex than most places in the country. I'm like, well, why is that? I'm like, I personally believe, if you read legislative history and intent, it goes back to how much we valued certainly Texas for sure, in the South in general, property rights and homestead rights. Texas is probably values them more than anybody. I mean, look at the ag exemption, for example, right? And the ag exemption resulted out of wanting to protect and keeping farms in place, right? Like, that's where the agricultural exemption came from. That was 150 years ago. Right? I mean, but we haven't changed it because we value property rights so much here. We value homestead rights so much here. We value protecting them.
Well, Texas is known as the asset protection state. I mean, think about it. The homestead law, you'd be blown away. It even protects personal property, you know, cow, horse, donkey, a couple of guns or whatever. But, you know, you look at it and go, no other state does that. I mean, you know, you go to Georgia, they foreclose on your house, they'll take your car. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I mean, that's why. But it's such a good point too. Where for the consumers that move to Texas, it is important to understand that we do protect the homestead, and a lot of people aren't used to when they move here and they're like, well, God, Lee, I haven't paid my credit card bill in 2 months. Can they take my house? No.
No.
Heck no, they can't. And I'm not encouraging people not to pay their bills, but you should pay your bills. Plus people fall on hard times, and Texas is protects the homestead much more than most states.
Yeah. Well, you gotta have a place to live.
Gotta have a place to live.
Gotta have a place.
And of course, the best place to live.
Yes, and not even up for debate, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I went to law school in Colorado, and I love Colorado, but I came back here as quick as I could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this podcast might be brought to you by Texas.
That's right.
There's beauty in everywhere, though. I'm not
beauty.
Yeah, I'm telling you. But a lot of the places with that beauty also look good in the rearview mirror. You know what I'm saying? That's what I always say. Man. They're great to visit. There you guys go. I'm going back home. See y'all later. All right. So I was going to go back to what a lot of questions were when it came to the builder's contract. I mean, that'd be a great time to wrap this up of, some of the great questions of, some of the things that possibly can happen and or some good advice. I guess I shouldn't say advice, but some good tips on what to look for. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think for a lot of buyers, the first line of defense is the real estate agent, right? I mean, what I think a lot of I don't want to say mistakes because I don't want to call them mistakes, but I just had one yesterday where a buyer entered into a contract with the builder's like, we don't need your agent, don't worry about it. And agents, brokers, you guys, you're experienced, right? You know what you're looking at. So if you were looking at a contract, you might go, oh geez, the earnest money is non-refundable. It's got a convenience clause for terminating. They've got a 2-year out for closing. This needs to trigger some red flags. Maybe consider this house. But a lot of buyers, you sort of go into especially in the last 2 or 3 years, you just walk into these new subdivisions. Ooh, beautiful spec house, right? And then you don't have an agent. And so I think that's probably the first mistake that a lot of consumers make is not having an agent when you go under contract with a new build. But let's just assume now you've went under contract, or some of the things that you need to look for before you go under contract is, what is the deposit? Is it refundable or is it non-refundable? Most build job contracts, and look, I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you guys. I represent some builders, and I may or may not have drafted that the earnest money is not refundable, right? Because there are costs that are associated with builders, especially if they have to go acquire the lot or they've got to develop it. But you have to look and see whether your deposit's refundable or non-refundable. Because if you're putting down a $30,000 deposit that's non-refundable under any circumstance outside of a builder's default, it's going to be very hard to get your money back, right? The second thing you got to look for in build job contracts or new build contracts are these, the second thing are the convenience clauses I've already referred to, which is essentially a builder saying, I can terminate this contract for convenience. I can just terminate it, right? And I think that's a bit illusory under the law. I think nobody's really challenged it, to my knowledge. An illusory promise, which would be unenforceable. Nobody's challenged it that I'm aware of, but nonetheless they exist. So I think it's borderline. I think it gets close to that level. But that's one thing about Texas, that we very much believe in the parties' abilities to negotiate and execute a contract. We don't like to meddle in people's drafting a contract. So that's one sort of the flip side to Texas being the way it is. I'd say the third thing you got to think about too in contracts with builders are escalation of costs clauses. Right. We saw that a lot during COVID or the COVID years or whatever, where you saw it go under contract and all of a sudden supplies were impossible to get. And so now you've got these, I'm increasing your sales price by 30% because this is what the cost of the materials. So we call them escalation of costs clauses. I think those are very important for consumers to look at. I mean, those are probably the three biggest things I would let consumers know about. And then just a general statement about builder contracts. Both of you, I'm sure, have probably seen this. A lot of these have built-in arbitration provisions, right? The beautiful thing about a jury is that a jury, for the most part, looks at the consumer, right? But a lot of these builder contracts have a jury waiver and then an arbitration clause. And when you go to arbitration, it's a construction lawyer or a real estate lawyer that's handling the dispute, right? And going through and going, this is what the law says, this is what the facts are. They don't particularly, it's not their job to particularly care about your emotions, right? Whereas a jury could consider emotions, right? Because they're human. But construction lawyers, real estate lawyers, we're just looking at what the contract says and what the facts are. And so for arbitration provisions, it's one thing you have to look for that in as a consumer, because if you go to arbitration and you lose, then you're paying the builder's side or the builder's attorney's fees. And so arbitration can become this thing that goes from a $20,000 possible in attorney's fees or damages to hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And so it discourages consumers from suing builders, because you can't really sue the builder because you got to go to arbitration. When you go to arbitration, you find yourself going in front of a construction lawyer that's going to have a pretty good idea of what the law says and what the contract says and what the facts say. And it's not favorable to a consumer whatsoever. Yeah. So those are really probably the big four things that I see, or I get at least asked about every day.
I got a big question for you.
Sure.
Under the TREC rule 537, we can use our TREC forms. That's what it's all about, right? Using our TREC forms. And if we use our TREC forms or advise on the TREC forms per se, it's not unauthorized practice of law as long as we explain the actual, line, not legally, rights, remedies, and so on. Yeah. So if it is a builder's contract, is that riding the edge of unauthorized practice of law for an agent?
Yeah, I mean, I think Melissa's maybe even heard me joke about this, but I feel like every day real estate agents commit the unauthorized practice of law, right? I mean, literally every day, because you're taking a contract that's been drafted by lawyers and you're going through and you're reviewing it, and most of the time you're probably interpreting it, which to me rises to the level of unauthorized practice of law. Now, are you allowed to do that? Yes. So you can go through the contract, you can't interpret it, you can't, you can say, well, this is what it says, and you can refer them to the provision. The builder contract, when you use the TREC form, you've got a safeguard. When you're using a builder contract, when you're answering questions about what the legal ramifications are, hell, when you answer questions like, well, when they say, what should my deposit be? And you say, well, I think 20,000 seems reasonable. Boom, that's the unauthorized practice of law, right? You can't do that. So that's where agents, I think you've got probably one of the hardest jobs in the world, which is walking that fine line of giving great customer service to your client, but staying within the rules. I think it's virtually impossible to do. But I think the easiest thing that you can do as an agent is you've got a good punt, right? You can punt and say, hey, look, this is a contract. I'm prohibited from the unauthorized practice of law. However, I've got an attorney you can call. His name's Sean or whoever, and here's his cell phone number. Call him, discuss it with him, and then have him call me or you call me after you've spoken to him if you have any legal questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about the contract based on my experience, but I just can't give you any sort of legal advice. It's just an easy punt for agents, and one that really should be used a lot more than it probably is.
Yeah, we can't give legal advice. It's a big deal. So yeah.
It's hard though when you got.
All right, and I'm with Sean. I think everybody rides that line. I mean, it's not hard to cross.
It's just not hard to cross. I mean, it's
so simple to do.
I mean, it's so simple to do. Hey, not that you would ever do this, but hey, Stephen, if I terminate under the option period, am I get my earnest money back? And you answer the question like, yeah, you'll get, I mean, you wouldn't answer it, but a lot of agents say, oh yeah, it's unrestricted right to terminate. Yeah, you'll get it back. That's the practice of law, because you just told them, gave them a legal consequence to an action, which is
rights, remedies, conditions, and provisions.
Okay.
Hey, it's like I tell people all the time.
That's it.
Just sit there and look pretty.
Sit there and look pretty. That's right.
Can't tell them anything.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely do ride that fine line. Thanks for clarifying that, because I think a lot of agents don't really understand what that fine line really is. And I don't think a lot of consumers, because you look at them and say, that's not going to make you look very good either, so
well, I wish I could,
if you will.
I think it's important too, and I wish that I personally could even educate consumers more on the expectations to have for a real estate agent or a real estate broker, right? I mean, I'm so passionate about real estate agents. I love y'all. It's a very difficult position to be in. And I really wish I could adjust the expectations so that it wasn't so much, well, no, they need to answer this question. And if you don't answer the question, then they're pissed off and they're upset. And it just shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think what happened was a lot of it too, you know, fiduciary duties fall into play. You go through all your agency class, everybody gets freaked out when they leave, you know, they're afraid to talk. And then, you know, obviously Trek added scrupulous and meticulous. So all of a sudden we're supposed to know everything under the sun. And then we have every ways of finding this information. We're just a walking encyclopedia.
that's
You
right.
know, you got AI all of a sudden. You can say, hey Siri, is that in a flood zone? You know, yeah, okay. You know, so they're expecting us to be the walking, talking
They
encyclopedia.
are, and they're therapists too. No kidding.
Yeah, yeah, I wear that hat quite a bit. So
I mean, but it's an emotional experience, you know. I'll joke.
it really
It's
is.
such an emotional experience that you want as much advice as you can get. And I think that's where having a good real estate agent or broker and an attorney involved that can discuss that with the client is so critically important. And I mean, I've never charged somebody that was like, an agent was like, hey, call Sean. And I'm like, I'm not going to be like, oh, hey, I answered 10 minutes of your questions. Here's an invoice. Like, I just don't do that. I feel like it's just a way to get back to the consumers and to the community that I think desperately needs it.
And we do. Absolutely.
Agreed.
Well, y'all, we've had some really great discussion today, but it is time to wrap up the podcast. So thanks, Sean, for being here. We super appreciate you and all of your good words of wisdom today.
Well, I'm a talker, Melissa. I probably talk too much in some of those answers, but
You know what? The more educated people are, the better off they are. That's the bottom line. So good job. Appreciate it.
1,000%. And if you're still sticking around with us, join us next time on the Estate of Reality podcast, because this is where we talk about the real reality of the real estate profession. So we will see y'all next time.